Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, How to Predict the Chances of Success of Your Operational Excellence Program and How to Improve Your Chances. A webinar organized by Möbius Consulting. Welcome, everybody, to this webinar. Some practicalities before we start. This webinar will be recorded, and the slides and the webinar recording will be shared afterwards. If you have an issue, an urgent issue, or a question that cannot wait until the Q&A session that we will do in the end, please raise your hand. For this, you have a button and the left upper corner where you can indicate that you have an issue. The text box below you can use to enter your questions. You can already start entering questions if you like for the end, and during the entire session you can enter questions. During the session we will also have some interactive parts, and then we also ask to give your input. This is also the same way we will ask to give your input, so put it in the chat box and then we will receive your answers. So, central topic of today's webinar is the low sustainability number of operational excellence implementations. So research shows that only 10% of operational excellence implementations are successful, which is a quite low number. And we want to ask you, before we go into the research, what is, according to you, the single most important reason why operational excellence implementations fail? So I would love to ask you to enter your inputs through the chat area. So already see some answers coming in. I see lack of business need, no burning platform, lack of performance culture, missing the know-how of the personnel, so the people themselves, lack of support, also a lack of understanding from the management, a lack of focus, a lack of leadership, lack of management support. I see a lack of discipline. So we see a lot of misunderstanding, some things in the culture and leadership, but also with employees, of a misunderstanding of what operational excellence is about, and the focus on doing it. So let's now see what research says about this topic. So first part of today's agenda, we will present the research of the Massey University and the insights we got out of this research. Then we will go into some experience on how to increase your chances on success, some best practices, and at the end we will foresee about 15 to 10 minutes to answer some questions. As said, you can at all time put your questions in the question area. We will try to answer as many as possible. In case your question was not answered during the session, know that we will deal with them afterwards and send you feedback on your question via email. So who will speak for you today? First we have Professor Nigel Creek. He is part of the Massey University. He is the group leader and professor of quality systems. He is actually Scottish, but is living now already for 14 years in New Zealand. He's a real subject matter expert on quality. He has already spoken on this topic a lot, and a prize-winning publisher on these topics. Afterwards, Gert will take over and he will share some best practices on how to increase your chances on success, on sustainability. He has a scientific background as a bioengineer, but during his experience at Möbius, he developed expertise and a passion for operational excellence. The passion is so big that he even built his house using lean principles. He wanted to eliminate waste as much as possible, so no fixed walls, no hallways, a very lean environment. I love to pass the word to the first speaker, Professor Nigel Creek. Okay, Professor Creek, sorry, I muted you. Yes, you can speak now, thank you.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and good night if you live in New Zealand. It's currently 2 o'clock in the morning, but I've had some coffee, so I'm all good. This is a picture of New Zealand, and it's just a few little facts to by way of introduction. New Zealand's an 80% service economy, but there's still a fairly important manufacturing sector here that employs about 200,000 people, and we have a lot of very innovative small startup companies. Most of the organisations in New Zealand are small. We have a few large ones like the dairy company Fonterra, which is a cooperative, but generally speaking, by European and international standards, the companies are typically less than 20 employees, for many of them less than 10. So that's the kind of context. But the manufacturing sector is, as I say, innovative, and it's very important to the economy. Okay. So Gert, if I could have just the words on the next, yeah. Here. So New Zealand's a little famous for its Kiwi culture. We've got very independent people. We believe in innovative solutions. Number 8 wire solutions they're known as, because Kiwis do a lot of things with thick wire. There's a thing called she'll be right, which is to say, don't worry about it, it'll be fine. Not invented here. And there's even a thing called the 3 Bs, which is the boat, batch, and BMW, which is the aspirational lifestyle for Kiwi business owners. So that's a little bit of the background. This study is based on 11 companies, manufacturing companies in New Zealand, who were part of the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise Programme to kickstart lean. Now, these were high growth potential companies that the government decided would be worth investing in. So there was in one case, there was a trip to Japan for a week or so to get immersed in some lean practices in Japanese companies, followed by a funded consultancy where a consultant would come into the organization and help them for a year with their lean implementation. There were several waves of this. The first wave was known as the Aichi project. It was part of this Aichi funding, which is a Japanese New Zealand thing, and that took place in 2004 and 2005 and 2007. Then there was a second sort of approach, which was a more direct approach, and it was slightly differently configured, but again, another set of organizations were involved in this one. So it's a total of 23 companies went through these two methods, 15 for Aichi and another 8 for the direct. Where we came into this was, this had happened between 2004 and 2008, so we came along in about 2009, and there had been another study previous to ours by another university which looked at the implementation effectiveness of this program. We decided to come along a little bit later and look at the sustainability of the lean in these organizations. So to that end, we were waiting at least 1 or 2 years after the implementation to see if it was being sustained. Okay. For this, we received $10,000 from NZT&E to conduct this research, and we employed a researcher who was completing a master's. We calibrated a research protocol. We looked at the literature, we developed some themes from the literature, many of the things that you mentioned in the previous exercise there when you were giving these reasons. And that formed the basis of a case study protocol. We went and we spoke to managers and looked at the physical organization, at the cleanliness, at the orderliness, at the visual management systems and things like that. That became part of the whole case study. So that took place around about 2009, and there was a thesis resulted in 2010, and also a report for NZT&E, which is available. If you can't find a copy, I can supply a copy. Stage 2 was a follow-up. That was 2015. So having done this sustainability study in 2009, we thought, well, let's do it again a few years later and see if our prediction that we made in 2009 has actually come to pass. So I'll talk about that shortly. Data collection. So the first stage, the 2009, as I say, was interviews and observational tours. The second stage was more remote through telephone interviews with the current senior managers in those organizations to say, with reference to this lean program, how's progress been? Data analysis techniques, we collected a lot of qualitative data, we developed the themes from that data, and we mapped out those themes onto cognitive maps and so on. We then looked for cross-case patterns, and from the cross-case themes, we matched those themes back to literature. Okay, thank you. So, as I mentioned, we had 23 organizations to choose from. We eventually got engagement from 11 of those organizations who were prepared to be involved in the first stage of the study. So, given what we heard at the beginning, about 10% of interventions being successful, it's kind of interesting what comes up. Before we even began the data collection, 2 of these organizations ceased operations, and remember, of course, this is 2009, so the global financial crisis had kicked in, so a lot of these organizations were really struggling, and lean was seen as a sort of lifeboat in some cases. Anyway, 2 went out of business, and we ended up with 9 organizations who we were involved in this study. Of the 9 organizations, by the end of this first wave, we predicted that there would be one which is likely to sustain, but still had some issues, but was likely to sustain because they had really embedded this thinking. The other 8 we predicted didn't look particularly good. Okay. And then in 2015, the prediction more or less came to pass. We had one which sustained its lean journey, and that was the one that we did predict would sustain back in 2009. Of the remaining 8, 4 had abandoned lean, 2 basically refused or didn't want to be involved in any research, in other words, to tell us why. 2 others were prepared, so we spoke to them. 2 were trying to re-implement lean, and 2 were still trying to sustain their original intervention. So that's how that kind of looked. Now, for the organization's sort of makeup, if you like, we had some medical device manufacturers, kitchen appliances, manufacturers of boats, aviation products. Most of the organizations were job shops, not much continuous flow or high volume manufacturing. Okay, yep, so if we can move on. So what we can learn from this research, we're just going to look at what common problems we can maybe detect, what factors can help us in the prediction of failure or success, and what are the observed patterns that cause these common problems. So these were the themes which came out from the cross-case analysis. We identified an erroneous understanding of lean and these other issues that you see here, and we'll possibly pause at this point and let you enter a bit of data in response to a question. which I think is here. So what was the most common problem according to you? So I'll just take a short break and let you enter your responses to this.
So please enter A, B, C, D, E, F, or G in the question area again, so we can see what you think is the most common problem that these organizations faced. So I see a lot of answers coming in. And it seems that that actually B is for you guys the winning answer: lack of a senior management team commitment. That's the most given answer. Next to that, we see the second most, I think, is F, employee resistance. So let's see what this research said.
Okay, so based on our reasonably small sample here, all of the organizations with problems sustaining lean, we found, in fact, a lack of a change strategy. So in this case, for example, one organization had the goal of being world class, and that was the stated aim, but no particular plan for how to get there. So lean was seen as a possible means to this end, but there was no real implementation plan for that strategy. So lack of an action plan to support the strategy was definitely prevalent there, and no plan for change, for improvements, and so on. Secondly, the organization were not addressing the real problems in terms of the voice of the customer. So problems were being tackled for sure, tools were being used, but these weren't really being driven by the voice of the customer in terms of these were the obvious problems to tackle. So it was a bit like an exercise in just using tools for the sake of it. We'll probably say more about this, but this is really almost a function of being shown a tool and then thinking, well, we better use this, which is one of the big problems that we really encountered. There was a bit of a lack of an entry and an exit plan for the consultant. By this we mean the consultant was funded by Trade and Enterprise, it was fine, so there was no problem getting the consultant in. But then the strategy for who the consultant would engage with and interact with in terms of a change champion or a lean champion was lacking. And the exit plan, basically, at the end of the time, the consultant would leave, and then what do we do now? So in the lack of engagement with the champion, of course, there was nobody to pick up the ball. And a lot of the time, once the consultant went with his knowledge, his expertise, or her expertise, then basically the lean would just fall apart. And we found a lack of robust systems for measuring improvements. So very little baselining. In other words, where are we currently? So what is this improvement exercise that we've just tackled? Where is it taking us to? One of the things, of course, that many methodologies now emphasize more is the actual development of a good measurement system first. So this was another thing lacking in our companies. Secondly, the lack of the erroneous understanding of lean was a major barrier. Now that's just kind of a New Zealand problem, really. There's a general one of the findings from our main report was that there's a general lack of management education. There are many managers who start a very successful business and then continue to manage that business, but never really seek the education to underpin the management side of things. So we get a very powerful entrepreneur maybe who maybe lacks the management ability. Some managers take training courses, but there's very little of that deep underpinning education. We do have MBA programs and so on, but not everybody does those. So part of the erroneous understanding of lean, so first of all it was seen as a step-by-step logical and linear program. Now one of the reasons that was a perception is because one of the models that was being used by the majority of these organizations was called the Kobayashi 20 Keys. The Kobayashi 20 Keys is a good model, but in New Zealand it's extremely prescriptive. For our very small, dynamic, flexible organizations, it's quite rigorous. So there's a lot of stages to it, a lot of steps. That tends to inhibit the sustainability of it, and that's what we found anyway. Secondly, a standard prescriptive tool for short-term productivity gains. So lean was seen as being something that would maybe get organizations out of the current problem by shaving costs. Well, of course, we know that that's not a good way to look at it. And finally, there was no ongoing training, widespread training within the organization to get everybody, up to speed on the methods. And I think we heard at the very beginning the lack of management training as well, and that was the case here. So top management, apart from being committed, also had to be knowledgeable about what lean was. And I'm sure that some of you have encountered a situation where a CEO maybe brings a consultant in but isn't present themselves at the sessions. And this is one of our things that we've seen several times here, many times in fact. Then comes lack of senior management commitment, and so I'm not claiming statistical reliability for the ordering of these results, but based on our small sample of qualitative organizations, this is what we found as number 3. Because we found that some of the senior management were in fact quite committed to the process, but just didn't really have the knowledge to drive it. So it wasn't necessarily commitment that was lacking, it was just the knowledge and ability. So what we found is leaders were not engaged in some cases with the role in the lean transformation. In other words, what their role as the driver, as the champion, as the leader of this. The general understanding of what lean really means was lacking. That's the simple tenets of lean, as opposed to the tools, the demand, the value and the flow and so on. That kind of philosophical side of it was definitely lacking. Where a deep understanding of that can show a manager that certain tools may not be appropriate, and it can be tailored. And finally, this far too high reliance on the consultant and the consultant's knowledge. So an organization became reliant upon the consultant's input, and when the consultant left, there was really nobody to keep that going. And again, that's a common situation. And we just have a few more here, just little other ones. The lack of development of the champion's capabilities, a high staff turnover, some employee resistance. Employees in New Zealand can be very resistant to change, and that's something that came through in a lot of the quotes that we got from direct quotes from managers and from employees. And the funding was pushing the program, in fact pushing the tools, which of course we really want these tools to be pulled by the need for them rather than pushed because they're useful tools. Okay, next slide please. So just some general patterns, and I'll just talk very quickly about the model that we used as a central model here. Okay, so this is the sustainable lean iceberg model. We selected this from several models, including the 4 Ps, the House of Sustainability, the lean management system from Mann, and so on. We like this model. It seemed very intuitive, and it had a good number, just five key constructs that we could deal with. So we found in our organizations that were failing that they were focusing indeed above the waterline. They were looking at technology, tools and techniques. They were using 5S, they were using SMED, whatever tools they thought were good and they were being shown. Maybe they were using value stream mapping, but not perhaps with an actual identification of what the value was. So it was a mapping exercise, but not necessarily a value stream. And the focus on the processes at the expense of the deeper things. In the organizations that were succeeding, one organization that was succeeding, we did notice there was a very clear, a deep understanding from the CEO, who just incidentally had replaced a previous CEO who had been sacked in a takeover. So the new CEO held back a little bit, and when they thought the time was right and all the systems were in place, then he engaged with Lean. So he was already fairly committed and showing good leadership. So the strategy and alignment was there. The leadership was definitely prevalent, and the behaviors and engagement were visible. So this organization was trying to get the philosophy instilled into the DNA of the workforce. So that was the basis of our prediction. Really, we noticed that far more of the under the waterline tenets were there, and that we therefore predicted this organization would be more likely to sustain, and in fact that's what happened. So just beneath the waterline then, so despite a clear vision and articulated goals, there was a poor strategy deployment. The leaders with a lack of understanding among the senior management team, and again a general lack of understanding, and some of the improvements were being attempted during slack time rather than being worked into normal working practices. On the plus side, for the more successful organization, we observed a need to align the implementation with the overall strategy, for leaders to focus on ongoing training and nurturing people, and for a lean champion to be developed. That was absolutely crucial, somebody to take on the job of the consultant and become the consultant within the organization. Okay, so our conclusion, a good balance of the above the waterline elements is essential. You can use the tools, but there has to be the under the waterline systems as well, or the under the waterline philosophies in place. And again, you can't have the other without the first, so you can't really build Lean without any tools. So the philosophy alone won't do it. You've got to have some methods, some tools to help you with it. Okay, so that's the sort of basis of our research. And I think at this hand I can hand you over to Geert.
Good afternoon, everyone. So thank you, Professor Creek, for explaining the research quite thoroughly. When we look to these findings and we extrapolate them to the rest of the world or other organizations or countries, then we see that this kind of results you see everywhere around the world. And research has been done on this even decades ago. And one of those important researches was done by the Shingo Institute, which researched the difference between organizations that kept on growing, their improvement rates, while others fell back. And in fact, they came to a very similar conclusion. Because let's say in a traditional Western way of thinking, we fundamentally believe that if we set up the right systems, which are made up by the right set of tools, think of budget systems, think of incentive systems, think of any kind of way of organizing and tools, the physical things you're using, we believe that those will create results. And of course, this is not the case, because tools never create results. It are the people using them. And unlike many other models, the Shingo model is saying that the culture, which is defined as a sum of behaviors you can observe, is not one of the elements, but the element. The most important element around which you can build your systems and tools, but not the other way around. And the good thing about their research is that they also research the principles behind a high performance culture which keeps on improving. So in fact the good news is that if you look at it as a puzzle, then you can say that the pieces of the puzzle are on the table. So there's no need to search for them, let's say, below the table, but make a puzzle of it. And I think that's maybe the most important thing to learn after 60 years of operational excellence, because it's already been almost 70 years even, is that how comes that it's so difficult to translate something which seems obvious and is obviously successful in some organizations into our own culture. And I think the wording is important. It's translating it into our own organization instead of copying it. And I think there has been too much copying over the last decades. What the Shingo Institute has done, and the 10 principles are here in the pyramid, is in fact they generalized the principles or the basics of what those excellent organizations were doing into principles that are applicable across region, across country culture, and across industry. Because nothing of what they do is specific for automotive. Nothing of what they do is specific for industry even. Because if you talk about what those cultures are typical for, I'm not going to go into all those kind of principles, but the fact that in a culture when you want to create this, that humility and respect is fundamental, it's the case all around the world. The fact that creating value for a customer, for any organization, even a non-profit one, that value creation is the reason of being. For any organization counts that quality at the source is a very important aspect of improving, being it in a hospital, be it in an air freight company, be it in any kind of company. So the most important value of their research is that they made it generic across those domains and applicable to each organization, which doesn't mean that you don't need to do the exercise of translating it into your organization. This is, in fact, the key to success, to start there. When we try to translate this into how can you set up a program, a way of implementing this without having the common problems, the 10%, how can you increase that? Then it's, in fact, this is a very important slide, I think. If you look at improvement, we have several levels of improvement. You have large improvement initiatives, we call them typically projects, and those projects, we set them up for their result. And in fact, for their results specifically, because if we set up a project on improving quality, on reducing inventory, on implementing a new IT system, we want to have direct results with those projects. We don't do them, and this is important, to change culture, because they don't change culture. Therefore, they're much too slow and much too focused on the individual business case and result. And that's what you have to do. You need to pick those projects very carefully, pick very few and very aligned to your strategy. But they won't change your culture. That's what the small improvements do. The small improvements, on the contrary, you do them, and that's something we learned at Toyotas, is that for every big improvement, you need 1,000 small ones. The small ones are the ones that are the fitness for your organization, the humus in which operational excellence can grow. And you, in fact, do them, and this was quite an astonishment when we first learned that. The number of improvement implemented is more important than the direct results. Because, in fact, what they were saying there is that the direct results is for the employees. You want to have the sustainability, the change that is a permanent characteristic of your organization, and this is built by those everyday small improvements. And it's only if you have those breakthrough projects and that thousands of small ones in balance that you have a continuously improving result. The breakthroughs create 90% of the results, the small ones only 10, but those are the ones that make it sustainable. So if understanding this, because this requires a quite systemic point of view, which is typical in an Eastern culture, if we understand the value of large initiatives versus the small ones, then the set of a program is much easier. And we have to understand the return on investment of each of them, or it's direct results, or it's, let's say, the building up of muscles for your organization. So if you can link that to your business objectives and sustain it by a good frame around it, then you have in fact a program on which you can build. If we go a bit further on this, on 5, 6 best practices, the first one I wanted to come back on was the fact that you should not measure the small improvements by their results only. You should measure them, and they are very important, but they are more important for motivation reasons and for the people than for, let's say, the direct result for the organization. It are the breakthrough projects that should deliver the breakthrough results. And to have an example, on the left you have an example of a hospital here in Belgium, in Brussels, where people were frustrated that they had to do the same movements over and over again in the operation theater. And they had asked technical service to help them with that, didn't get an answer on it, and after months of frustration, they found an old telephone arm in the basement and they fixed it themselves. And the result of that was that per operation, they didn't need to turn their back 10 times. It was around 45,000 times a year. So the direct result of this is not €1. The indirect result of this was that people started understanding how they could change their own work. On the other hand, on the right, you see a product of Barco, a projector, and at a certain point in time, one of the operators of the shipping department wondered why they only shipped one projector per air freight pallet. A lot of you know that air freight pallets are extremely, or air freight is extremely expensive, and he wondered why they didn't put 4 projectors on one. And they start searching, and after a week they said, yeah, we don't find any reason, let's try. And as of that moment, they shipped 4 projectors instead of 1. They gained €2 million per year on this one. And their first reaction was, this is a very big improvement. We should have more on this. But that's in fact not what it's about. The €2 million is what you gain by continuously doing it. But the difference between those type of improvements, there is nothing on it. In both cases, people start thinking about improving their own work. And the moment you realize that the €2 million is a benefit, but the true value is the fact that people think, then you have understood Lean truly. Okay, when we look at another one, when you see companies that are, or organizations that are going for a Shingo Prize, which is considered as the Nobel Prize in Operational Excellence around the world, then what they have learned on their journey, which typically takes 10 years, is that you should define your own behaviors, your own culture up front. Because the moment you can make explicit and define what your culture is, what the behaviors you want to see, if you say, I respect people, then you would expect me, for instance, as a leader, that I would thank people for their efforts when they do it. Or when I believe in scientific thinking, then I help people in creating small PDCA cycles for improvement, and I create a safe environment for them. So the behavior, the moment you make this explicit, and it's not quite a difficult exercise, once you understand the principles, you can go onto the floor and observe the actual behaviors, the ideal ones and the non-ideal ones, but then you can start seeing this is what we want, and then you can define it. And the moment you define them, you have an ideal base for coaching, you have an ideal base for building up your systems and your tools. And it's only then that systems and tools come into play, once you know what behavior you want to see. And then you can ask yourself, does the system, does this budget system, does this incentive system, does this quality system help my people in going to that ideal behavior and showing that ideal behavior? So it's the other way around. First defining your culture, and then the system and tools around it. If you talk about those behaviors, you see typically that more mature organizations, and this is an example of Barco's in Belgium, which is quite a known example, go into the floor and observe those key behaviors, appreciate people for them, or ask them why they deviate. And what they also do on a higher level is they measure key behavioral indicators. For instance, the number of Gemba walks done, the number of improvement ideas implemented, the number of times a near-miss accident was put into the system. So the behavioral indicators, in fact, show more correlation with future success than KPIs do, which talk about past performance. So for operational excellence, those behavioral indicators are more correlated to future success, so to predict if you will be sustainable, than typical KPIs would be. Because if you gain this year 100,000 euros or have 0 accidents, but there is no basis for that on systems or behavioral basis, then this tells nothing about the next year. And this is important to understand. Something I think is quite known is that for changing the culture, so the small improvements, let's say, the all-sustain approach is the best one. If you want to convince people that this is successful, you can't do this with words. They can only be convinced and truly motivated if they start seeing it in their own environment. That's why we should always start, and it's a picture of Kotter here, Accelerate in Harvard Business Review, who states you have to start with the guiding coalition, start with the enthusiastic people, not with the biggest gap. That's where you put your strategic projects, with the enthusiastic people, and show them how it can work in your organization. And once it works, bring other people around and start spreading the fire. An example here, for instance, is Volvo Cars has a very nice simulated work environment where you can go train together with the team. This is an example of a management team together with team leaders and operators training together at the start of such a program, and directly after thinking about what can we start doing in our organization and how can we support this. Or another one is a value stream mapping together with customers as a start of a base. So think of enthusiasm as a good fuel to spread this around. On the part of how can you have a valuable collaboration between consultants and internal people, but also between the internal lean coach and the management line, the principle of kata coaching is quite important. It's quite important that you ask an expert for his expertise. And if you want to build sustainable excellence, you need to build the capabilities for this. And an excellent way of doing this is the kata coaching method, which is a kind of specific, easy method to solve problems and meanwhile coaching people while doing it. And in fact, a lot of the routines, the tools, as Professor Grigg told them, they have a good side effect. Once people start being together and do an improvement meeting, a daily start, a Gemba walk, it's quite an easy coaching touch point. So as a coach, internally or externally, you should use those operational touch points that can be real problems that can be seen in the morning, and use them for root cause analysis, use them for Gemba walks, and so on. So in fact, you should build capabilities, not solve problems as a coach. And I think this is a kind of maturity we still have to grow to as consultants on the one hand side, but also as customers, that we ask the right question to the consultant also. And also to our internal coaches, because they cannot be responsible for the program. That's only the management line that can do that. So a supporting coach supports and the line leads. This is in fact what you need to build around. A last one, and this is an example of one of the most mature companies in the world, Rexam. One of our colleagues, Momar, has helped in some of those deployments. But what is specific here, and what is important here, are not the numbers. The numbers are quite extreme, that I can tell you. But what is more important is that those numbers keep on improving over 7 years, and that those numbers are across all domains. So you typically see in a very mature organization, a very cost-effective company will also be a very qualitative and also a very safe environment. If you're operational excellence, it's across all domains. And this is quite important for large organizations. Too often you see a safety program coming up, and a quality program and a cost program, and every 3 years people on the floor have the feeling that the strategy changes. If you want to be successful in operational excellence, you need to have an umbrella program for the next 10 years and put your initiatives below that. But keep on communicating in the same way around all those topics, because the same behavior is required to see an improvement on cost, quality, or safety. So there is nothing different around it. So it's a loss of time, money, and enthusiasm if you piecemeal them. Although you have the feeling that in a large organization this is needed, this is not the case. You need to do it via a pilot, but from the start, however small, try to do it in an integrated way. This was the last last, let's say, practice we wanted to share. For those who are interested, in 4 weeks' time, there is a more in-depth course on those principles. It's in Brussels, and Cargill will be hosting us on the second day. Thank you very much for that, people of Cargill. So for those interested, you can find the information via our website. And what I want to do now is go over to the Q&A. So if you have questions, then this is the moment.
So please, if you have any questions, enter it through the chat screen or the question area screen. Okay. One question coming in for Professor Creek. So you told the story about the research in New Zealand. However, could you state that the findings can be generalized, one, for organizations in other parts of the world? And the question is actually twofold. Also, it was done in a manufacturing environment. Would you say that these findings could also apply in other sectors?
Yes, I've always had the view, and it just gets stronger all the time, that the type of organization is, once you get down to the process and system level, it kind of doesn't matter what the organization is. And I think we're finding this out now with the extent to which healthcare is getting onto the lean and kind of Six Sigma tools and so on. If you understand process, then if everything is a process, then it's simply a question of defining the process well, and the system falls out of that. So the other thing I think is that the central principles we're talking about here are not sector specific, they're generic principles. So leadership is a generic principle that can apply to defence, to corrections, to healthcare, to government, to local government, to you name it. It's a pervasive and sort of transcendental thing, and process awareness can be as well. So yeah, I think the only reason we chose manufacturing organisations, or we decided to do this research on them, is because at that time the government had decided to boost these manufacturing companies because of manufacturing's position relative to services. But since that work began, we've done quite a lot of work with services as well. The same things, the same learnings come out, and in fact you'll find a lot of CEOs now, or a lot of senior managers, or even just managers, are moving between sectors quite happily. They're coming from manufacturing and straight into healthcare. They're going from healthcare into services. So yes, I think once you go across a country boundary, then the only other fly in the ointment is the cultural barrier. Most of my own research now is moving towards culture, because culture is the big variable to my mind that is really interesting to look at these days. It's organizational culture, national culture, and the mixture of these things.
Okay. Thank you for your answer. I see also questions on the presentation. So again, the presentation will be shared, as also the recording. We will also share the input of the attendees given during the presentation, also the readings and papers where you can find some more information. A next question for Gert Lindhout. When starting this from middle management out, internal staff, consulting, who needs to be on board? CEO, CO? What do you think, Gert?
That's a typical discussion in every organization. In larger organizations, typically, this rarely ever starts from the CEO. It's not very often that the CEO is the one that comes in and says, let's do operational excellence. It can be the case if someone has past experience and is so much of a believer that he does, but it rarely ever happens. I had an interesting discussion with this on one of the VPs at Abbott Vascular, who had just won the Shingo Prize in his own department. And his vision on this was, to my opinion, one of the most realistic. He said, you need to have top management in until the level of where they commit the resources. So he said, as a VP for my organization, I can commit the resources for this and also sustain this over a long time. So if I'm not in, this will never work. So typically in any organization, if we want to start this, very often we look to the others. Yeah, but the rest of the organizations won't start with this. And then you very often see that someone in middle management says, yes, but let's do it in our what we can do. Let's showcase this, and after 1 or 2 years, it's typically picked up on senior management level. And that's very often how it happens. At a certain point in time, if someone chooses not to wait and has sufficient, between brackets, power to make it happen within his part of the organization. So I wouldn't call it a specific title like CEO or COO, but let's say at least to the level where the resources are committed.
Okay, thank you, Gert. Another question is, how do you define a lean implementation is successful? So maybe a question for you, Professor Creek, how was successful or sustainability defined in the research?
Yeah, well, I don't really believe in lean implementation, I've got to say. Because the word implementation to me implies that it wasn't there one day and the next day it was there. So this is much, and this is just me. To me, it's much more of a drop in the ocean. You drop that drop in the ocean and it spreads, or you light the fire and it spreads. So sustainability, I think, is more accurate. You know, you can start these things, but the sustainability, the proof of the pudding, is only really when you could go into the organization in a year or 2 or 5 or 10 and still doing it. Then, and in fact, and when you can see that there's been obvious improvement, or at least, you know, growth, market share, whatever it might happen to be, then you can say it's worked. But for lean, you simply can't, I don't think. So walk in and say, yes, it's implemented. So yeah, that's my view on that one.
Okay, thank you. Another question on training. So maybe also for leadership, but in general in the organization, how do you build in training and make sure that the needed knowledge is at the needed level?
Well, let's say that I always say that there's no training on lean, that it doesn't exist, the ideal training, but of course you need training. What you typically see in literature, and a quite interesting book on that one is Thinking Fast and Slow, is that 95% of behavioral change happens while doing. That means also that the other 5% is on knowledge transfer via training. So our vision at Möbius is that if you do training, make sure that it's integrated, that it's not too theoretical, and that it compromises all different aspects, so that everyone can start seeing how the different aspects correlate together. For instance, the example that was in the slides, the Volvo training is quite a nice one. They also developed it after 15 years of experience or something internally, is that you bring people in an environment where they see the ideal state of where they want to go to for their organization. And you see that typically the team leaders coaching, you see the tools used, the ending cards, you see the visual management board, you see the 5S working, you see the integrated objective setting and so on. And that's something very often where we see that people start seeing what it can mean for them. And then typically very important is that on the day after or shortly after, you ask them, what do you think you can use for this in your environment, and you start testing this. So the link between training, which should be integrated, and practice should be very short. And with short, we mean days, not weeks, not months. So it has no use at all to train people across the organization if they are not directly after involved in a part of the pilot or implementation.
A more specific question, also for you, Gert Lindhout. It is possible to apply the culture change to only one direction in a hospital. The example given, the nursing director is really interested, but the CEO not really. Could the nurse make small improvements every day and still spread them to the care of the patient?
Yeah, I've worked for almost 10 years in hospitals, and this is quite a tricky question, I must say. We try to do this sometimes because there is a very specific way of organizing in a hospital in which the medical department is split, let's say, from the rest of the organization, which is difficult to understand for people not working in a hospital, I notice. So people working inside will laugh and the other ones will try to understand what I'm saying. To be honest, I don't believe that this is the sustainable way. In fact, I think the integrated level is quite important, and we manage sometimes to get a part of the group enthusiastic and even into a kind of rhythm and behavior of which the patients could benefit. But to be honest, I have never seen once a project succeed on the long term in which doctors were not involved from the start. So I don't know if the CEO needs to be involved, but at least the doctors, the medicinal part of that unit is involved. Otherwise, you miss, let's say, the actors that decide or have the power within that organization or that unit. So yeah, I think the bad news is that you cannot do this partially. That doesn't mean you need to do it for the whole hospital at once. But if you take a unit, for instance, a ward or the operation theater or the pharmacy, you won't succeed if you cannot take all stakeholders and certainly not the doctors in.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much all for the questions. Our time is running out, so in case your question was not handled, don't worry. We will react on it via email and share our input afterwards. In case questions come up later or remarks, if you want to discuss this topic further, you will find our contact information in the slides, which we will share afterwards, as also the recording. Thank you very much for your attention, and hope to see or hear you soon.
Thanks, everyone.